Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Superman Distant Fires. Now, this is a graphic novel written by Howard Chaykin, I think is how you say his name, and illustrated by Gil Kane and Kevin Nowlan. Now, this was published by DC Comics in 1998 and features the character of Superman originally created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Now, this is an Elseworlds comic. Elseworlds is something that DC does sometimes where they're stories that feature some of their most popular characters that are specifically set outside of continuity. They're stories that are set in their own universes or timelines. And this is actually a post-apocalyptic Superman story, which admittedly is a really cool idea, but unfortunately the comic itself is really mediocre in my opinion. Now, you can tell that this comic was written in the late 90s, right before the turn of the century and the new millennium, because this is very much playing on the whole Y2K scare that was going on at the time. Like, the comic actually opens up where there's a computer glitch that causes all the world's nukes to launch at the same time, bringing about a nuclear Armageddon. But basically, in the comic, we follow Superman after this apocalypse, who has now lost his powers because the sun is blocked out, and he seems to be the only survivor of a decimated metropolis. And the radiation has caused animals to grow bigger, and it's caused some people to turn into mutants. So, in the story, Superman gets out of Metropolis, and he eventually runs into Wonder Woman, who has also survived, and she has also somehow lost her powers, even though, last I checked, her powers had nothing to do with the sun like Superman, so it doesn't really explain how she lost her powers, and basically, Wonder Woman shows him, like, this whole group of survivors, including some former superheroes and supervillains who are now regular humans. Because of the nuclear war, they lost their powers, but again, it doesn't really explain how they lost their powers. And Superman and all these other survivors try to rebuild civilization, but the main villain of the comic is actually Billy Batson, or Shazam, or Captain Marvel, not to be confused with Marvel's version of Captain Marvel, and he's, like, insanely jealous of Superman, and he ends up breaking away from the group, and some people follow him, and ultimately you get two groups of survivors, one group led by Superman, and the other led by Billy Batson, and Billy Batson starts to get his powers back, and ultimately a war breaks out between the two groups. It's a cool idea, but ultimately it's a very mediocre execution. My main problem with this is it doesn't really explain anything. Like, it doesn't explain how Wonder Woman and Billy Batson lost their powers because of the nuclear war, because both of them got their powers from magic. Their powers had nothing to do with the sun, and the same thing with a lot of the other superheroes that you see in the story. It also doesn't really explain why Billy Batson is all of a sudden a raging douchebag. I mean, I understand that this is an Elseworlds story. It's a story that is set outside of continuity, but even so, if this is like its own version of Billy Batson, at least explain it a little bit better. The motivations for the characters also didn't really make a lot of sense to me. Like, okay, why are all of a sudden all these people following Billy Batson's lead? The comic also really wastes the whole post-apocalyptic setting. I mean, after Superman gets away from Metropolis, the rest of America, while it's definitely changed, it doesn't really come off as that bad. Sure, you have giant animals and mutants running around, but they do end up making a pretty decent little society, and they make things relatively livable, and it doesn't really seem like that harsh of a setting. It probably doesn't help that I read this right after reading the Mark Waid, Alex Ross comic Kingdom Come, which also features Billy Batson as one of the villains, but that was done so much better, and you could tell that this comic was somewhat inspired by that, but this really does feel like a lamer version of that. But yeah, Superman Distant Fires I just found to be painfully mediocre. It's not terrible, but it's also not a great comic either, and I feel like there's a lot of wasted potential with this. But yeah, that was my review on Distant Fires, and bye.